Welcome back. Well, you would have seen earlier the Police Minister, Bheki Cele, explaining the, again, dramatic increase in the number of violent crimes that we've seen in the country. Murder up, assault up, rape, unfortunately, it's very, very high number of women still being attacked and the victims of sexual assault, and also attempted murder up once again. Dr Jean Redpath is a senior researcher at the Africa Criminal Justice Reform at the Dullah Omar Institute. Dr Redpath, good afternoon to you. If you look at the crimes that really worry people, murder, sexual offence, attempted murder, assault, the crimes of violence, they're all up by over 10% compared to the same quarter last year, some by nearly 20%. Why are these numbers so high?
I think one has to be very careful when one is looking at comparing to the previous year, because we've got to remember we were in a highly unusual situation of lockdowns and stages being rapidly changed, and so it's almost impossible to compare with the previous year. And it's important to then go and look back to 2019, which is the last normal year that we had. And it's also important to concentrate on the more reliable crime types, which are murder and aggravated robbery, because those types get to be reported more frequently. In other words, people are more likely to report them, and so they're more reliable. And unfortunately, when you do that, the picture is even worse, even taking population into account. If you compare 2019 to the current year, for South Africa as a whole, we're looking at a 29%, 30% increase in murder over that time period. Now, the population certainly hasn't grown by that amount, so we can be absolutely sure that a large proportion of that is an actual increase. What is of very great concern is KwaZulu-Natal. If you do that calculation, you get a 51% increase in murder compared to 2019. And that's a very concerning picture across the country. As to the reasons why, well, we've seen something of a collapse in law and order across the country.
You say collapse in law and order. I mean, it seems almost as if something's changed in our society. We've always had high levels of violence. We understand the sort of nature of our society and our past and why. Is this also because of a breakdown of policing then? Are you suggesting the police just are not able to maintain security for people?
So policing makes a difference on the edges, and evidence from the Global South shows that bad policing has more of an impact in making things worse than good policing does in making things better. So there is an impact of police, but we've got to also remember that we had 2 years of huge economic disruption and lockdown, which is going to be feeding in to the situation that we currently see. So yes, policing is part of the picture, and the breakdown in law and order is part of the picture, but we've also got to see the socioeconomic consequences of the last 2 years coming home to roost.
The Minister said today that he wants police to meet fire with fire. Now, I've never been a police officer. If I was shot at by someone, I would probably use a gun if I had one. I can't say for sure what I would do, actually. But that sort of phrase, and we've seen this before in our society from police leaders, to use fire, to meet fire with fire. Is that the right approach?
Absolutely not. It's in fact, it's of deep concern that the Minister would advocate such a policy. Obviously, one can protect oneself in a situation of self-defense, of defending other people, but to actively encourage indiscriminate shooting is something of deep concern. And phrasing like that can be misinterpreted to mean a more kind of indiscriminate approach, rather than the very carefully worded and very good approach which we have in our law is that, yes, in protection of life, we can defend ourselves with lethal force if it's proportionate. But that kind of statement from the Minister is of deep concern and is not going to help the situation at all.
The Western Cape's been using a program called LEAP, the Law Enforcement Advancement Program. Does that system work? Is that something that could be copied in other places, or are there specific reasons why it works there?
Yes, I've managed to have a quick look at the latest data. Certainly the previous quarters, again comparing to 2019, showed that LEAP areas seem to be faring much better off than if you compare to comparable areas. In this current set of data, there is a 1% decrease, there's a 4% increase overall for the two sets of LEAP deployment in murder, but we know that the population of the Western Cape has increased by more than 5%. So it's a stabilization. But if you look at equivalent areas of township areas where LEAP are deployed, there's been, as we can see by the large figures for the rest of the country, a much larger increase. As to whether the model is replicated, it works because it is, firstly, these are not just people that are picked up with the streets, given a gun and thrown into the situation. They are they are trained, they are vetted. This is a very important process. The vetting process includes a test to see basic skills such as reading and writing. And in fact, something like 75% of the applicants did not pass that test. So it's a select few that make it through. Then there is vetting to see if there are any links with gangs or previous employment where there's been disciplinary hearings. And a further lot of people are excluded on that basis. And then they are fed into an existing criminal justice institution, which is the law enforcement service of the City of Cape Town, which has been established and existing for a long time and has established systems of discipline, command and control of firearms, which is a very important thing, because firearms are very often hired out by people who have them to gangsters when they're not using them. But there's a very strict control of the use of firearms in law enforcement services in the City of Cape Town. So things like that, where you have a system and an institutional structure in place, then additional deployment can have the kind of impact that we're seeing in the LEAP areas. It would be very dangerous to simply hire 2,000 people in a vacuum without that institutional structure, without proper vetting, without training, and give them firearms. In fact, then we would see the situation of bad policing probably making the situation worse. So it's very important how it is done. LEAP is by no means perfect, and in fact the vetting was brought in when some undesirable people with links to gangs were hired in error. So it's a learning process, but there are lessons that we can learn from that deployment, which seems to be having impact, particularly in the LEAP 1, what I call the LEAP 1 areas, which was the first deployment, where the somewhat more experienced people were deployed and where they've had a year longer to have an impact than the LEAP 2 areas.
Dr. Jean Redpath, thank you. A senior researcher at the Dullah Omar Institute. There are so many different elements to look at when it comes to these numbers and different things to examine. I'm sure you, like many other people, will be wondering, how can they bring down crime in the area in which you live? Well, we'll have more on this in just a moment.